The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the ornate corridors that had witnessed centuries of royal history. Charles walked slowly through these familiar halls, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floors. Each step felt heavier than the last, carrying the weight of a grief so profound that it seemed to settle into his very bones. The news had come just hours before dawn. Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, the man who had been the backbone of the royal family for over 7 decades, was gone. Charles had received the call in his private chambers at Clarence House, and, for a moment, the world had simply stopped. The voice on the other end of the line had been gentle, but clear, delivering words that would change everything. Now, as he made his way toward his mother's private apartments, Charles felt the full magnitude of what lay ahead. He was no longer just a son mourning his father. He was the heir apparent tasked with supporting a monarch who had just lost her greatest companion. The dual nature of his grief felt overwhelming. The personal loss of a father intertwined with the constitutional responsibility he carried. The Queen's private secretary met him outside her chambers, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of emotion. "Your Royal Highness," he whispered, "Her Majesty has been awake since the early hours. She's in the drawing room, looking through photographs." The man's voice caught slightly as he continued, "She hasn't spoken much, but she asked specifically for you." Charles nodded, straightening his shoulders as he prepared to enter. He had faced many challenging moments in his life, but nothing had prepared him for this. Through the heavy oak door, he could hear the faint sound of his mother's voice, soft and distant, as if she were speaking to someone who wasn't there. When he entered the drawing room, the sight that greeted him nearly broke his composure entirely. The Queen, always so regal and composed in public, sat in a simple armchair wearing a modest dress, her hair not yet styled for the day. Around her were scattered dozens of photographs, pictures spanning decades of her life with Philip. Wedding photos, family portraits, candid shots from their travels, images of state dinners, and private moments alike. She looked up when she heard him enter, and Charles saw something in her eyes that he had rarely witnessed before. Not just sadness, but a kind of lost confusion, as if the very foundation of her world had been shaken. "Charles," she said simply, her voice smaller than he had ever heard it. He crossed the room quickly, kneeling beside her chair without regard for protocol. "Mother," he said softly, reaching out to take her hand. Her fingers were cold and trembling slightly, so different from the steady hands that had signed countless documents and waved to millions of people over the years. "He was supposed to be here for my 100th birthday," she said suddenly, holding up a photograph of Philip from their recent anniversary celebration. "We joked about it just last week. He said he was planning to outlive me just to see the look on everyone's faces." A small, sad smile played at her lips. He always did have a wicked sense of humor. Charles felt his throat tighten as he watched his mother clutch the photograph. This wasn't the Queen speaking. This was simply a wife who had lost her husband of 73 years. The weight of her grief was palpable, filling the room like a physical presence. "Tell me about this one," Charles said gently, pointing to a black and white photograph of his parents dancing at some long-ago state function. He knew that sometimes the best gift he could give was simply to listen. The Queen's eyes brightened slightly as she picked up the photo. "This was in Malta, 1949. We were so young then, and Philip was still serving in the Navy. We had these precious months when we could almost pretend to be a normal couple." Her voice took on a dreamy quality as she remembered. "He was such a wonderful dancer, so confident, so sure of himself. He would spin me around the floor like we were the only 2 people in the room." As she spoke, Charles could see decades of memories playing across her face. The early years of marriage, the challenges of royal life, the births of their children, the countless state occasions they had navigated together. Philip had been her constant companion through it all, the one person who could make her laugh during the most formal ceremonies, who could calm her nerves before difficult speeches, who understood the unique pressures of royal life better than anyone. "I don't know how to do this without him," she confessed suddenly, the words tumbling out as if they had been held back by a dam that had finally burst. For 73 years, he's been there. Every decision, every public appearance, every crisis, he was always there with his advice, his support, his terrible jokes. She laughed softly through her tears. He could always make me laugh, even when I wanted to throttle him for some inappropriate comment he'd made to a foreign dignitary. Charles felt his own eyes filling with tears as he listened to his mother's raw honesty. This was a side of her that the public never saw, the private woman behind the crown. "You won't have to do it alone," he assured her. "We're all here. The family, the staff, the entire nation. Everyone wants to support you through this." The Queen looked at him with an expression that was both grateful and skeptical. "But they can't replace him, can they? No one can fill that particular void." She set down the photograph and turned her full attention to Charles. "Your father was my strength, Charles. People see the crown, the ceremonies, the public appearances, and they think I'm strong because of my position. But the truth is, I was strong because of him." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of unspoken dependence and love. Charles realized that his mother was sharing something profound with him, something that went to the very heart of who she was as a person rather than as a monarch. "He believed in me when I doubted myself," she continued. "When I became queen so young, so unprepared, he never once made me feel inadequate. He stepped back from his own career, his own ambitions, to support mine. Do you know how rare that is? How extraordinary?" Charles didn't know, and the knowledge made his father's loss even more poignant. Philip had given up a promising naval career to become the Queen's consort, taking on a role that had no real precedent or clear definition. He had had to create his own path while always walking 2 steps behind his wife in public, supporting her reign while maintaining his own sense of purpose and dignity. "I remember when you were born," the Queen said suddenly, her voice taking on a warmer tone. Philip was so nervous. He paced outside the delivery room like a caged lion, demanding updates from the doctors every 5 minutes. When they finally told him he had a son, he burst into the room before anyone could stop him. "Protocol be damned," he said. He wanted to see his boy. Charles smiled through his tears, imagining his father's impatience with royal protocol even in such a personal moment. He never was one for following the rules when it came to family. Was he? Never, the Queen agreed. "Remember when you children were small? And he would organize those elaborate treasure hunts around the castle. He would spend hours creating clues and hiding prizes, getting more excited about it than any of you. The staff thought he was completely mad, turning the staterooms into a playground." The memory brought a genuine smile to both their faces. Philip's relationship with his children had been complex, shaped by the demands of royal life and the expectations of his generation, but it had also been filled with moments of pure joy and connection. "He was so proud of you, you know," the Queen said, reaching out to touch Charles's cheek. "He didn't always show in the way you might have wanted, but he was incredibly proud. Just last month, he was telling me about your work with the Prince's Trust, how you've helped so many young people find their way in life. He said you had inherited the best parts of both of us, my sense of duty and his desire to make a real difference." The words hit Charles like a physical blow, touching a deep well of emotion he had been trying to contain. His relationship with his father had been complicated, marked by different temperaments and occasional conflicts over the years. Philip's direct, no-nonsense approach had sometimes clashed with Charles's more thoughtful, introspective nature. But underneath it all, there had always been love and respect. "I wish I had told him that more often," Charles said quietly. "I wish I had let him know how much I appreciated everything he did for our family, for the country, for you especially." The Queen squeezed his hand. He knew, darling. Philip wasn't one for sentimental conversations, but he knew. The way you've prepared for your future role, the dedication you've shown to your charities, the father you've become to William and Harry, he saw all of that. He was proud. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, surrounded by the photographs that told the story of a remarkable partnership. Outside, Charles could hear the distant sounds of the castle coming to life. staff members going about their duties, gardeners tending to the grounds, the everyday rhythms of royal life that would continue despite this monumental loss. "What happens now?" the Queen asked suddenly, and Charles heard both the monarch and the grieving widow in that simple question. "Now we take it one day at a time," he replied. "We plan a funeral that honors everything he meant to you, to our family, and to the country. We help each other through the grief. And we find a way to carry on his legacy while building something new." The Queen nodded slowly, her fingers still tracing the edges of the photographs. "He would want us to carry on, wouldn't he?" He had no patience for prolonged mourning or self-pity. "Get on with it," he would say. That was always his answer to any crisis. "Yes," Charles agreed. "But he would also want you to take the time you need to grieve." Even Philip understood that some losses require more than just getting on with it. As the morning progressed, mother and son continued to sit together, sharing memories and planning for the difficult days ahead. The photographs around them served as silent witnesses to a love story that had played out on the world stage for more than 7 decades. Each image captured not just moments in royal history, but the intimate story of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed to fulfill their extraordinary destiny. Charles realized that this moment, sitting with his grieving mother, surrounded by memories of his father, was perhaps the most important conversation of his life. Not because of what was said, but because of what was shared, the raw humanity beneath the royal roles, the simple truth of love and loss that connects all families, regardless of their station in life. The sun climbed higher outside the windows, and soon the business of royal life would intrude upon this private moment of grief. There would be statements to approve, funeral arrangements to finalize, and a nation to address. But for now, in the quiet sanctuary of the Queen's drawing room, a son comforted his mother, and two people who had rarely had the luxury of showing vulnerability found strength in their shared sorrow. The afternoon brought with it the inevitable intrusion of duty upon grief. Charles had spent the morning with his mother, but now the machinery of royal protocol began to assert itself. Private secretaries appeared with gentle knocks and urgent whispers, bringing documents that required immediate attention and decisions that could not wait for a more convenient time. Charles found himself in the unusual position of serving as a buffer between the Queen and the outside world. For the first time in her long reign, she seemed genuinely fragile, not quite ready to resume the public face that had served her so well for nearly 70 years. He moved between her private apartments and the administrative offices, making decisions on her behalf and ensuring that her grief was respected even as the business of monarchy continued. "The Prime Minister wishes to speak with Her Majesty," announced Sir Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary, as he approached Charles in one of the castle's smaller drawing rooms. "He's calling to express his condolences and to discuss the arrangements for the Duke's funeral." Charles considered this carefully. His mother would need to speak with the Prime Minister eventually. Protocol demanded it, and the funeral arrangements would require her input. But she was still so raw, so vulnerable. Every conversation today felt like it might shatter whatever composure she had managed to gather. "Can you give her another hour?" Charles asked. "She's resting now, and I think it would be better if she could have a little more time to process everything before she has to speak officially to anyone." The private secretary nodded understandingly. He had served the royal family for many years and had witnessed the Queen navigate numerous crises with grace and dignity. But this was different. The loss of Prince Philip struck at the very heart of who she was, not just as a monarch, but as a woman. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. I'll inform Number 10 that Her Majesty will call back within the next 2 hours. They're very understanding of the circumstances." As the afternoon progressed, Charles found himself coordinating not just the official response to his father's death, but also the family's private grieving process. William and Harry were flying in from their respective homes, and was driving up from her estate in Gloucestershire. Andrew and Edward would arrive by evening. The prospect of having all the children together was both comforting and daunting, Their grief would multiply in each other's presence, but so would their support for one another. Charles returned to his mother's apartments to find her standing by the window, looking out over the gardens where Philip had spent so many hours in recent years. The Duke had been passionate about landscaping and had personally overseen many improvements to the castle grounds. Even in his 90s, he could often be found directing gardeners or examining some new planting with the enthusiasm of a much younger man. "He planted those roses last spring," the Queen said without turning around as Charles entered. "He was so excited about them. Said they were a new variety that would bloom longer than the traditional ones. He wanted to make sure I could enjoy them from this window, even when the weather was too cold for walking in the gardens." Charles joined her at the window, following her gaze to the rose garden below. The flowers were in full bloom, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the somber mood that had settled over the castle. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful gesture that had characterized Philip's approach to their life together. Practical, caring, and focused on making his wife's daily experience more pleasant. "He thought of everything, didn't he?" Charles observed. "Always planning ahead, always trying to make life better for everyone around him." "Always," the Queen agreed. Even yesterday morning, he was talking about the garden party season, making suggestions about which organizations we should invite, which young people should be honored. His mind was always working, always thinking about the next event, the next opportunity to make a positive impact. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Princess Anne entered, having arrived earlier than expected. Her usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain, her eyes red-rimmed from crying during the drive to Windsor. She had always been perhaps the most like her father in temperament, direct, practical, and uncompromising in her dedication to duty. "Mummy," Anne said simply, crossing the room to embrace the Queen. Mother and daughter held each other tightly, and Charles could see his sister's shoulders shaking as she struggled to contain her emotion. "He went peacefully," and said when they finally separated. "I spoke with his doctor this morning. He wasn't in any pain. He simply went to sleep and didn't wake up." The doctor said it was exactly the kind of end Philip would have wanted. No fuss, no prolonged illness, no being a burden to anyone. The Queen nodded, seeming to find some comfort in this information. Philip had always been adamant about not wanting to be a burden in his old age, and his family had worried about how he would handle any serious illness or incapacity. In some ways, this peaceful passing was a mercy, even though it left them all unprepared for the sudden finality of it. "We need to talk about the funeral arrangements," and continued gently. "I know it's difficult, but there are decisions that need to be made soon. The ceremonial aspects, the guest list, whether it will be a state funeral or something more private." Charles saw his mother stiffen slightly at the mention of these practical matters. She was still deep in the personal grief of losing her husband, but royal duty was already intruding with its demands for protocol and ceremony. "Philip made his wishes very clear," the Queen said after a long pause. "No state funeral. He was adamant about that. He wanted something more private, more personal. He said he didn't want all that fuss, as he put it." This was so typical of Philip that both Charles and Anne almost smiled despite their grief. The Duke had always been uncomfortable with excessive ceremony when it came to his own recognition. He preferred to support others rather than be the center of attention, and even his final farewell would reflect that characteristic humility. What did he want instead? Charles asked gently. "A ceremonial funeral at St. George's Chapel," the Queen replied. "Something befitting his rank and service, but not the full state treatment. He wanted the focus to be on his military service and his charitable work, not on the pomp and circumstance of royalty. He said he hoped people would remember what he tried to accomplish rather than just the titles he held." The three of them began to discuss the practical details, finding some measure of comfort in having concrete tasks to focus on. Philip's military affiliations would be represented, his charitable organizations would be honored, and the ceremony would reflect both his royal status and his personal preferences for simplicity over grandeur. "What about the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme?" Anne asked. "Surely that should be prominently featured. It was his greatest pride." Charles nodded emphatically. The Duke of Edinburgh Award had been Philip's most successful and enduring legacy, helping millions of young people around the world develop confidence, skills, and a sense of service. It was the kind of practical, life-changing initiative that perfectly embodied his approach to royal duty. Absolutely, the Queen agreed. He would want the young people to know that the program will continue, that his death doesn't mean the end of something he cared about so deeply. As they talked, Charles noticed his mother gradually regaining some of her characteristic composure. The act of planning and decision-making seemed to provide a framework for her grief, giving her something concrete to focus on rather than just the vast emptiness of loss. "I should call the Prime Minister now," she said eventually, "and we'll need to coordinate with the Archbishop of Canterbury about the service." Philip had some very specific ideas about what he did and didn't want included. Charles felt a surge of admiration for his mother's resilience. Even in the depths of her personal sorrow, she was beginning to reassert her sense of duty and responsibility. It was a testament to both her character and to the decades of training Philip had provided in managing the balance between personal feelings and public obligations. The late afternoon brought the arrival of William and Harry, who had flown in together from London. Their presence seemed to lift the Queen's spirits considerably. She had always had a special relationship with her grandchildren, and their genuine affection for her was evident in how they surrounded her with gentle attention and care. "Grandpapa was asking about you both just last week," the Queen told them as they sat together in the drawing room. "Harry, he wanted to know how you were settling into California, whether you were happy with your new life. And William, he was so proud of how you handled that environmental summit. He said you had real substance, not just charm." Harry's eyes filled with tears at the mention of his grandfather's interest in his life, despite the geographical distance and the complications that had arisen in recent years. The Duke had always maintained his concern for all his grandchildren, regardless of their personal choices or the controversy that sometimes surrounded them. "I wish I had visited more often," Harry said quietly. "I keep thinking about all the conversations we didn't have, all the advice he won't be able to give." William reached over and squeezed his brother's shoulder. Despite their own complicated relationship in recent years, their shared grief over their grandfather's death seemed to bridge some of the distance that had grown between them. He understood, William assured him. Grandpapa always said that life was about making choices and living with them. He didn't expect everyone to make the same choices he would have made. The Queen nodded approvingly at William's words. Philip had indeed been remarkably non-judgmental about his family members' personal decisions, even when they complicated royal protocol or caused public relations challenges. "Your grandfather believed in authenticity above all else," she told her grandsons. "He would rather see you living honestly according to your own convictions than performing a role that didn't suit you. He respected courage, even when it led people in directions he wouldn't have chosen himself." As evening approached, more family members arrived. Edward came with Sophie, and Andrew drove in from his home nearby. The Queen's apartment, usually a sanctuary of quiet order, filled with the controlled chaos of a family gathering under extraordinary circumstances. Charles watched his mother carefully as she interacted with her children and their families. She seemed to draw strength from their presence, even as their collective grief created an emotional intensity that was sometimes overwhelming. This was the first time in decades that the family had gathered without Philip's organizing presence, and everyone seemed slightly lost without his familiar role as the patriarch who kept conversations moving and tensions from becoming too heavy. "Remember when Grandpapa organized that cricket match for my birthday?" William said suddenly, addressing the room in general. He must have been nearly 80, but he insisted on bowling, and he was absolutely determined to get Charles out. "He did get me out," Charles admitted with a rueful smile. "Clean bowled me with a delivery that would have made any professional player proud. Then he spent the rest of the day telling anyone who would listen about his devastating googly." The story prompted other memories, and gradually the room filled with gentle laughter as family members shared their favorite Philip stories. It was exactly what the Duke would have wanted. His death marked not with prolonged solemnity, but with celebration of the joy and energy he had brought to their lives. The Queen listened to these stories with a mixture of sadness and pride, occasionally adding her own memories to the collection. Charles could see that this sharing of memories was helping her process her grief, while also reinforcing the positive legacy Philip had left behind. As the family dinner was served in the Queen's private dining room, Charles reflected on how this day had transformed his understanding of his parents' relationship and his own role in the family's future. Seeing his mother's vulnerability had been difficult, but it had also revealed the depth of love and partnership that had sustained the royal family through 7 decades of public service. The evening ahead would bring more conversations, more shared memories, and the beginning of a new chapter in the royal family's history. But for now, Charles was content to sit with his family, sharing stories of the remarkable man who had shaped all their lives in profound and lasting ways. The evening meal had been a bittersweet affair, filled with gentle laughter interspersed with moments of profound sadness. As the family gathered around the Queen's private dining table, the absence of Philip's voice and presence created a void that seemed to echo through every conversation. Yet there was also something healing about being together, sharing memories, and supporting one another through this first difficult day. After dinner, as the younger members of the family gradually dispersed to their own quarters within the castle, Charles found himself alone again with his mother. The Queen sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands as she stared thoughtfully into the fireplace. The flames cast dancing shadows across her face, highlighting the exhaustion that she had been fighting all day. "Are you managing to eat anything, Mummy?" Charles asked gently, settling into the chair that had always been Philip's preferred spot. It felt strange to sit there, as if he were somehow intruding on sacred space, but he wanted to be close enough to his mother to provide whatever comfort he could. "A little," she replied, "though everything tastes like cardboard at the moment. Philip always said that grief was the price we pay for love, but I don't think I truly understood what he meant until now." Charles nodded, recognizing one of his father's characteristic observations. Philip had always been philosophical about life's challenges, approaching even the most difficult situations with a combination of practical wisdom and emotional intelligence that had served the royal family well through numerous crises. "He helped you through so many losses over the years," Charles observed. "Your father, your sister, your mother. He was always there to lean on when the burden became too heavy." "Always," the Queen confirmed. "When Papa died, I was so young, so unprepared to be Queen. I remember feeling completely overwhelmed by the responsibility, terrified that I would somehow fail the country or dishonor his memory. But Philip never let me wallow in self-doubt. He would listen to my fears, acknowledge them, and then help me find a way forward." She paused, her fingers absently turning her wedding ring as she spoke. It was a gesture Charles had noticed her making frequently throughout the day, as if the physical reminder of her marriage could somehow bridge the gap created by Philip's absence. "When Margaret died," the Queen continued, referring to her younger sister, "I thought I understood grief. But this is different. Margaret was my sister, my childhood companion, and losing her was devastating. But Philip was my everything, my advisor, my confidant, my anchor in every storm. I don't know how to be myself without him." The raw honesty of her words hit Charles like a physical blow. Throughout his life, he had seen his mother as an almost superhuman figure, someone who could handle any crisis with grace and composure. To witness her vulnerability so openly was both heartbreaking and profoundly moving. "You don't have to be anyone except yourself right now," he told her. "The country will understand if you need time to grieve. The institutional aspects of monarchy can continue without you having to perform at full capacity immediately." The Queen looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "But can they? The monarchy has survived for 1,000 years because it provides continuity and stability, especially during times of crisis. If I retreat from my duties now, what message does that send? It was a question that went to the heart of the modern monarchy's challenge, balancing the human needs of the individuals who wear the crown with the symbolic requirements of the institution they represent. Philip had understood this balance better than anyone, having spent decades helping the Queen navigate the tension between her personal life and her public role. Philip would tell you that the monarchy's greatest strength has always been its ability to show both strength and humanity, Charles said carefully. The people love you not just because you're their queen, but because you're a person they can relate to and respect. Showing your grief, taking the time you need to heal, that makes you more human, not less regal. They were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. One of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting entered with a message that had just arrived from Buckingham Palace. The public's response to the announcement of Philip's death had been overwhelming. Thousands of people had already gathered outside the palace gates, leaving flowers, cards, and personal tributes to the Duke. They want to pay their respects, the lady-in-waiting explained gently. The crowds are orderly and respectful, but they're growing by the hour. The palace staff are wondering about arrangements for public tributes and whether your majesty might consider making a brief appearance. Charles watched his mother's face carefully as she processed this information. He could see the conflict between her personal need for privacy and her ingrained sense of duty to the people who had supported her and Philip throughout their lives together. Not tonight, Charles said firmly before his mother could respond. Tomorrow, perhaps, when we've all had a chance to process this more fully. Tonight should be for family. The Queen looked at him gratefully, and he realized that his protective instincts had kicked in automatically. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly supporting his mother rather than simply following her lead. After the lady-in-waiting left, they sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The castle around them seemed unusually quiet, as if the very stones were mourning the loss of the man who had lived within these walls for so many decades. "Tell me about your father's last few days," the Queen said suddenly. "I know you visited him earlier this week. How did he seem to you?" Charles considered the question carefully. His last conversation with Philip had been on Tuesday, just 4 days ago, when he had stopped by for their regular weekly visit. At the time, nothing had seemed particularly unusual. His father had been in good spirits, engaged, and alert, though perhaps a bit more tired than usual. He was vintage Philip, Charles replied with a small smile. Completely engaged in everything that was happening, full of opinions about current events, asking detailed questions about my charity work. He had been reading about the climate summit and wanted to know whether I thought the young activists were having a real impact or just making noise. What did you tell him? I said both, probably. That the noise was necessary to get attention, but the real impact would come from sustained action over time. He seemed to approve of that assessment. Said it reminded him of his own approach to the Duke of Edinburgh Awards. Start with enthusiasm and energy, but build something that lasts. The Queen smiled at this characteristic response. Philip had always been interested in the long-term impact of initiatives rather than just their immediate publicity value. Did he seem resigned or peaceful or anything that might have suggested he knew? She asked. Charles thought carefully before responding. In retrospect, there might have been subtle signs, a certain reflective quality to their conversation, perhaps a bit more interest in family history than usual. But at the time, these had seemed like normal variations in his father's mood rather than any kind of premonition. There was one thing, Charles said slowly. He asked me to make sure you knew how proud he was of you. Not proud of your accomplishments, which he mentioned many times over the years, but proud of who you are as a person. He said that being married to you had been the greatest privilege of his life, and that he hoped you knew how much joy you had brought him. The Queen's eyes filled with tears, and she pressed a handkerchief to her face. He told you that, almost word for word. I thought it was a bit sentimental for him at the time, but now I wonder if he somehow knew it was important to say. They sat quietly again, but this time the silence felt less heavy. The knowledge that Philip's final communications had been expressions of love and gratitude seemed to provide some comfort to the Queen's grieving heart. "We need to think about your speech to the nation," Charles said gently, as the evening progressed. People will want to hear from you directly, and it might help you to have something meaningful to say about his life and legacy. The Queen nodded slowly. She had given many speeches over the years, but none under circumstances quite like these. How do you summarize a life as complex and accomplished as Philip's? How do you share personal grief with an entire nation while maintaining the dignity expected of the crown? He would want me to focus on service, she said thoughtfully. That was always his message. That privilege comes with responsibility, that a life well lived is one that makes a positive difference for others. The Duke of Edinburgh Award alone has touched millions of lives, Charles agreed. Young people all over the world have been challenged to push beyond their comfort zones, to serve their communities, to develop skills and confidence they never knew they had. That's an extraordinary legacy. He was so proud of that program, the Queen said, even more than his naval service, even more than his royal duties. He loved hearing from young people who had completed their awards, especially those who said the experience had changed their lives in some fundamental way. As they talked about Philip's legacy, Charles could see his mother gradually shifting from the raw grief of the morning to a more thoughtful consideration of how his life should be remembered and honored. It was a natural progression, and one that would serve her well as she faced the public aspects of mourning that lay ahead. There's something else we should discuss, Charles said carefully. Your role going forward. Obviously, nothing needs to change immediately, but Philip's death does alter the dynamics of how the monarchy functions. The Queen looked at him with sharp attention. Despite her grief, her mind was still clearly engaged with the constitutional and practical implications of her changed circumstances. You're thinking about succession, she said. It wasn't a question. I'm thinking about support, Charles corrected gently. Philip provided you with a kind of partnership that can't be replicated by anyone else. But the institution still needs to function, and you still need advisors and companions who can help carry the load. It was a delicate conversation, touching on issues that had been largely theoretical as long as Philip was alive. Now, suddenly, they had become urgent practical considerations. I'm not ready to abdicate, the Queen said firmly. Despite everything that's happened today, I still feel called to this role. But you're right that I'll need different kinds of support now. I'm here, Charles assured her. Whatever you need, however, I can help. I'm completely at your disposal. Looking at her son, the Queen felt a surge of gratitude mixed with a new kind of respect. Throughout this terrible day, Charles had shown a sensitivity and strength that reminded her powerfully of Philip in his younger days. The thought was both comforting and heartbreaking. Your father would be so proud of how you've handled today, she told him. The way you've put my needs first, the way you've managed the family dynamics, the way you've thought ahead to what needs to happen next. You're ready for whatever lies ahead. As midnight approached, Charles helped his mother prepare for bed, ensuring that she had everything she needed for what would undoubtedly be a difficult night. Before he left her apartments, she called him back for one final conversation. Thank you, she said simply. Not just for today, but for being the son and heir that Philip and I always hoped you would become. He may not be here to see what comes next, but his confidence in you was absolute. Charles kissed his mother's forehead gently and left her to whatever rest she might find. Walking through the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, he reflected on how fundamentally this day had changed not just his family, but his own understanding of his role and responsibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new grief, and new demands. But tonight had proven that the royal family could support each other through even the most devastating losses, and that the bonds Philip had helped forge over decades would endure long beyond his physical presence. The morning of the second day brought with it the harsh reality that grief, no matter how profound, must coexist with the demands of royal duty. Charles woke early in his quarters at Windsor Castle, having spent a restless night thinking about his mother, his father, and the enormous responsibility that now rested on his shoulders to guide the family through this crisis. When he arrived at the Queen's apartments, he found her already dressed and sitting at her desk, reviewing drafts of the speech she would deliver to the nation later that evening. Her lady-in-waiting had arranged the papers neatly, along with a cup of tea that had gone cold, suggesting the Queen had been working for some time. "You're up early, Mummy," Charles observed, noting the careful attention she was paying to each word and phrase in the draft speech. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted without looking up from the papers. "Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about what Philip would want me to say, how he would want to be remembered. The words need to be perfect, not for me, but for him." Charles pulled up a chair beside her desk and glanced at the drafts she had been working on. Even in her grief, his mother's instincts for communication remained sharp. The speech struck exactly the right balance between personal remembrance and public tribute, between royal formality and human emotion. "This is beautiful," he said, reading over her shoulder. "You've captured exactly who he was: the naval officer, the devoted husband, the dedicated public servant, the man who never sought the spotlight, but made everything around him better." "I keep worrying that I'm leaving something important out," the Queen said, her voice betraying the anxiety that had kept her awake. 73 years of marriage, 99 years of life. How do you distill all of that into a few minutes of television? It was a question that went beyond the technical challenge of speechwriting to the heart of how we honor a life well lived. Philip had been such a complex figure, sometimes controversial, always authentic, consistently dedicated to causes he believed in. Capturing that complexity while remaining accessible to a general audience required considerable skill. "Maybe the goal isn't to capture everything," Charles suggested gently. "Maybe it's to give people a way to understand what made him special, so they can appreciate his contributions and carry forward his example." The Queen looked up at him with interest. "What do you think made him special?" Charles considered the question seriously. He had been thinking about his father's legacy throughout the night, trying to identify what would be most important to preserve and remember. "His authenticity," Charles said finally. "In a world full of people playing roles and managing images, Philip never pretended to be anything other than exactly who he was. That could be uncomfortable sometimes, but it was also refreshing and honest. People always knew where they stood with him." "Yes," the Queen agreed. "He had no patience for artifice or pretense. Sometimes that got him into trouble with protocol officers and press secretaries, but it also meant that when he expressed approval or appreciation, people knew it was genuine." They spent the next hour refining the speech together, with Charles offering suggestions and the Queen testing different phrasings until she felt confident that every word reflected both her personal feelings and the public significance of Philip's life. It was collaborative work that reminded Charles of how his parents had always functioned as a team, each contributing their strengths to support their shared responsibilities. The morning also brought a steady stream of visitors and phone calls. Prime ministers past and present called to offer condolences and discuss funeral arrangements. Foreign heads of state sent personal messages expressing their respect for Philip and their sympathy for the Queen's loss. Religious leaders offered prayers and support. Charles found himself serving as a filter for these communications, taking calls and meetings when the Queen felt unable to engage directly, and summarizing important conversations for her when her input was specifically required. It was a role that felt natural to him, and he realized that this crisis was providing him with invaluable experience in supporting the monarch during her most vulnerable moments. "The President of the United States called personally," Charles reported after taking a lengthy call from Washington. He wanted to express not just official condolences, but personal appreciation for Philip's service during the war and his leadership in international environmental causes. He specifically mentioned the World Wildlife Fund and Philip's early recognition of climate change as a global challenge. The Queen nodded approvingly. Philip's environmental advocacy had been decades ahead of its time, and Charles was pleased that world leaders were recognizing this aspect of his father's legacy alongside his military service and royal duties. In the afternoon, Charles accompanied his mother on a brief appearance outside Windsor Castle to acknowledge the thousands of people who had gathered to pay their respects. The crowd was enormous, but respectful, many carrying flowers and handmade signs expressing their appreciation for Philip's service and their sympathy for the royal family. Walking beside the Queen as she greeted members of the public, Charles was struck by the genuine emotion on display. These weren't just polite expressions of condolence. They were heartfelt tributes from people whose lives had been touched, directly or indirectly, by Philip's work and example. "Your husband was an inspiration to my son," one woman told the Queen, tears streaming down her face. "My boy completed his Duke of Edinburgh Gold Award last year, and it gave him confidence he never had before." Prince Philip changed his life. He believed young people could accomplish extraordinary things if they were given the right challenges and support, the Queen replied, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "He would be so pleased to know the program made a difference for your son." Similar conversations took place throughout their 40-minute walkabout. Parents whose children had benefited from Philip's youth programs, veterans who had served alongside him during the war, environmental activists who credited him with early leadership in conservation efforts. All had come to express their personal gratitude for his life and work. "Did you see how she lit up when people talked about the Duke of Edinburgh Awards?" Charles asked, and as they walked back into the castle. His sister had joined them for the public appearance, providing additional support for their mother during what could have been an overwhelming experience. "It's because those stories prove that his life had meaning beyond just protocol and ceremony," and replied. "The awards were his greatest achievement because they created lasting change in people's lives. Knowing that his work will continue even after his death, that's probably the best comfort we can give her right now." That evening, the entire family gathered to watch the Queen deliver her televised address to the nation. It would be broadcast simultaneously across the Commonwealth, reaching an audience of hundreds of millions of people who had known Philip through his public service and who wanted to hear the Queen's personal tribute to his life. Charles sat beside his mother in the small studio that had been set up in one of Windsor Castle's staterooms. The technical crew worked quietly in the background, adjusting lights and testing audio levels, but the focus remained entirely on the Queen and her message to the people she had served alongside Philip for so many decades. "My husband Philip was my strength and stay for more than 70 years, the Queen began, her voice clear and steady despite the emotion behind her words. "He devoted his life to his duty, to his country, and to the Commonwealth, but above all to his family. He was loved and respected by people around the world for his authenticity, his service, and his unwavering commitment to making a positive difference." As Charles listened to his mother speak about Philip's military service, his environmental advocacy, his youth programs, and his role as a devoted husband and father, he felt proud of how she was honoring his memory while also providing comfort to the millions of people who were grieving alongside the royal family. Philip's legacy lives on not in monuments or memorials, but in the countless lives he touched through his work, the Queen continued. The young people who found confidence through his award scheme, the environmental causes he championed long before they became fashionable, the military personnel he served alongside, and the charitable organizations he supported, all of these represent the true measure of his extraordinary life. The speech concluded with a personal message that revealed the depth of the Queen's loss, while also expressing her determination to continue the work she and Philip had shared for so many years. "Philip and I were blessed to share a love that sustained us through every challenge and every triumph. While his physical presence is gone, the values he embodied, duty, service, authenticity, and an unwavering commitment to others, will continue to guide our family and our nation. I know he would want all of us to carry forward his example of service, to support one another, and to find joy even in our grief." When the cameras stopped rolling, the Queen sat quietly for a moment, gathering herself after the emotional effort of delivering such a personal message to such a vast audience. Charles reached over and squeezed her hand, proud of her strength and grace under such difficult circumstances. "Philip would have been so proud of that speech," he told her. You honored him beautifully, while also showing the nation that the monarchy can be both strong and human. The days that followed brought the complex logistics of organizing a funeral that would honor Philip's wishes while meeting the public's need to participate in his farewell. The ceremony at St. George's Chapel would be smaller than a full state funeral, but it would still involve military honors, representatives from his many charitable organizations, and family members from across Europe. Charles found himself deeply involved in these arrangements, working closely with his siblings to ensure that every detail reflected Philip's personality and preferences. They chose music that ranged from traditional hymns to pieces that Philip had particularly enjoyed. They selected readings that emphasized service and duty while also celebrating the joy and humor that Philip had brought to every aspect of his life. He wanted people to remember him as someone who tried to make a difference, the Queen told Charles as they finalized the order of service. Not as a perfect person, because he never claimed to be that, but as someone who used his position and privileges to serve others. As the funeral day approached, Charles reflected on how this experience had changed his understanding of his role as heir to the throne. Watching his mother navigate her grief while maintaining her constitutional responsibilities had given him new insight into the demands that awaited him as future king. More importantly, supporting his family through this crisis had shown him that leadership during times of loss requires not just strength and dignity, but also the willingness to be vulnerable, to share grief openly, and to find ways to honor the past while building hope for the future. On the morning of the funeral, Charles stood beside his mother as they prepared to say their final goodbye to the man who had been the foundation of their family for more than 7 decades. The Queen looked composed and regal in her black mourning dress, but Charles could see the deep sadness in her eyes as she prepared to face the world without her greatest supporter and companion. "Are you ready for this?" he asked gently, offering his arm for support as they prepared to leave for the chapel. "As ready as one can be for saying goodbye to a love that has lasted a lifetime," she replied. "But I know Philip is watching, probably making sardonic comments about the ceremony, and I know he would want us to celebrate his life rather than simply mourn his death." As they walked together towards St. George's Chapel, where hundreds of guests waited to honor Philip's memory, Charles felt the weight of history and the promise of the future. His father was gone, but the values he had embodied and the love he had shared would continue to guide the royal family through whatever challenges lay ahead. The funeral would mark the end of an era, but it would also represent a new beginning, a chance for the royal family to demonstrate that they could honor their past while adapting to meet the needs of a changing world, just as Philip would have wanted them to do.